So what I'll be talking about tonight is building complete neighborhoods and the components that are needed to really make a great urban experience. So a little bit of context, what's happening? The Bay Area is growing, we all know that, and these are some projections from MTC from their planned Bay Area. These are not goals, these are some projections based on trends. That doesn't mean that this is exactly what's going to happen, but there is going to be consistent growth happening throughout the whole Bay Area. And San Mateo is obviously part of that bigger picture in population, jobs, household, and housing growth. You may have noticed that there's a lot of congestion these days in the Bay Area. And part of it has to do with the really rapid growth that's been happening with so many jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs coming in over a very short period of time with very, very little housing being built to go along with it. People are moving around a lot to get those jobs. I myself live in Berkeley. My wife works in Oakland. I work in San Francisco, so we're moving around all the time. And I have projects in the South Bay, North Bay, all over. So there's this big, beautiful bay in the middle of everything that makes things inconvenient for us. So what's been happening is that there are fewer choices for people in where they can live and how they can live. If, let's say, you grew up in San Mateo and want to continue living here, it's become more and more expensive, so it can be hard for you to stay here. If you have a child that you raised here, and if they want to move back, they might not be able to move back here because of it's expensive. If you are a young family moving into the area, it can be tough for you, or a student. The list of constituents and demographics is pretty long, and the choices are fewer and fewer for everyone. And one thing I was thinking about today is that over the course of my life, I've lived in a lot of different places, in a lot of different types of housing that have responded to what my particular life situation is at that point, whether it's a small studio apartment. I live in a single family house with an ADU right now. I've lived in duplexes, triplexes, high rises, a little bit of everything, and it's kind of dependent on where I am in my life. So a change is difficult for everybody, and especially change in a small amount of time. Fears of displacement, quality of life, congestion. Sometimes it's different kinds of people moving in that can be scary for people. And then, of course, property value. Our greatest wealth for most people is the home that you own. How can design help create community? Design is a tool out of many, many tools that can help create community. San Mateo is never going to be San Francisco, and it's not going to be a really far out small town in the middle of the Central Valley. And I think San Mateo has this opportunity to be the sweet spot where there's livable density. It can be a convenient place, and there's lots of vibrancy, lots of life, lots of opportunity. And building a complete neighborhood means that there are lots of different things coming together in a relatively small amount of space. So home, work, school, play, connected by walking, bike, and transit to create social, beautiful, healthy spaces and increasing equity and diversity. What's really important is to not have single-use areas. Having a balance and mix of uses is really important so that people have the option of walking to work or taking the bus to work rather than having to get into the car to do everything that you need to do. There have been some significant projects recently, like the Apple Donut and the Google campus, that basically have turned their back to the cities in which they exist. And it's a lost opportunity. That's a lot of activity that could be participating in cities. And that is a trend that should be reversed. Density does not mean a bunch of high-rise tall buildings everywhere. It doesn't mean Manhattan. Density can happen at a variety of scales, and it's important that it occur at a variety of scales, both for affordability and just to have variety in the place that you live. No one wants to live in a boring place where everything is the same. So some of the ways to achieve variety in housing is to think about unit sizes. So there are trends right now to have micro units, small studio units. And the reason why people are doing studio units is because demographically people have smaller households, so they want to be able to live alone. And also from an affordability standpoint, smaller units are affordable by design. Smaller units means that they cost less to rent. And another important concept is to regulate overall form of the building. Within a certain size of building, you may be able to fit 50 units or 100 units. And the number of units should be, in my opinion, should be dependent on what the market is demanding at that point. And as long as people are comfortable with the overall scale and the detailing of the building. And from the outside, you can't tell whether it's 50 units or 100 units. It looks the same from a passerby's point of view. Having a diversity of units is really important as well. We don't want all new housing that's being built to be studio units. You want to have different household types, intergenerational households, to be able to live in a place. So that means having everything from smaller units to multi-bedroom units, which could be divided up into sort of semi-autonomous apartments. Some examples of housing variety on the left is a micro unit. That one is about 300 square feet. And a lot of people are perfectly comfortable living in this kind of situation, regardless of what generation they are. On the right is a 3-bedroom unit, and that 3-bedroom could be for a single family. It could be for roommates. It could be for students. It could be a variety of different households that want to live in this way, and they should have the option to do so. Accessory dwelling units. So accessory dwelling units are units that are added on to a house. They can be in an attic space, it can be in a basement, they can be in the backyard. They're often called granny flats as well. And this is a gentle way to densify a city. And I believe San Mateo has an ADU ordinance already, is that correct? So this is a gentle way to add people into your city without drastically changing the form. Of course, prioritizing peds and bikes is really important. Some people drive, some people take the bus, some people take the train. Everyone walks in a city, and biking is a good option as well, regardless of your age. And I've got two young kids, and I bike around with them, and it's important for me to have safe streets that they can bike on. And right now, there are a lot of places throughout the Bay Area where it's just not safe to do so. So parking is important, and I think I saw something here where parking is a really big, important topic for San Mateo, and it's a big, important topic for a lot of cities. San Mateo is not unique in this. But it's important to know that whenever you require a parking space, that is three-dimensional space that you're taking up that could be used for something else. And oftentimes that three-dimensional space could be used for housing. So every parking space corresponds to space that could be used for other more active, better uses. So it's important to know that trade-off. Building affordable housing near transit is really, really important. Poorer people tend to have lower car ownership, and they use transit more often. So it's a perfect nexus between transportation and affordability. Small lots. San Mateo and a lot of cities have small lots, and that's kind of what makes them great, is that there's a rhythm to them, and there's not too many buildings that are too big. There's always variety as you're walking down the street. And even though these are small lots, you can fit quite a bit of housing onto them. And that's another way, it's sort of an in-between place between accessory dwelling units and larger apartment buildings to build more housing into your city. So small lots in historic buildings. So this is an image from Mission Bay in San Francisco. There is an existing historic brick building, and then behind that is the new fire department and police station. So obviously the new building does not match the historic building, But what's really great about this is that they've retained the historic building. And, I'm sure the police department and the fire department would have loved to have a perfectly rectangular site where they could make a super efficient building. But it's really important to maintain key historic resources so that it provides some memory of the place, and it makes things a little bit messy for new things that are coming in. So there's variety that's built in there. The tools that we as designers use to regulate the size of buildings and how they work are things like setbacks, which is the distance from the property line to the front face of the building. Step backs, on upper floors, you can step back the building so it doesn't appear as tall when you're walking at the sidewalk. Bulk, that's the overall footprint of the building, the bigness of a building, in plan. And then the ground floor. And I think of all these different things, the ground floor is the most important thing. The first 20 or 30 feet of the building is what people really experience as they're walking down the street. What's happening above is less important. So getting the details right at the ground floor are really, really essential. And then there are other things like having spaces for cafe tables, having trees, having places, a buffer from traffic, having street parking, bike lanes. All these little details make a great urban experience. And then one of the things that's really important in the projects that I've worked on is having a tall ground floor. And that ground floor can be retail, it can be community uses, but it can also be townhouses. It doesn't have to all just be retail. But it's a great way to hide the parking that's happening behind it. Another key thing to making buildings work well, and this is regardless of style, it could be contemporary style or traditional style or whatever, but the thing that makes buildings feel at a human scale are the depth and the stepping of the building. So the depth is how much you carve back from the property line, and the stepping is having changes in height. If you were just to regulate, say, this building height for the whole block had to be 60 feet, let's say, you would get a pretty boring building that's going to fill up this whole block. But if you have some flexibility in how you're doing the heights and how you're pushing the building in and out, you get a much more interesting building. Building character and detail. I think one of the reasons why people don't like modern architecture is that there isn't the same amount of detail that you find in more traditional architecture. These are both contemporary buildings that were built in the past 2-3 years. And what I think both of them have is a sense of detail. There are changes in material, there's a texture to it. You can see that there are human-scaled elements here. It's not just flat, and it has a lot of texture and shadow to it. This is a stoop on a more modern building that I had worked on, and it too has texture, changes in materials, changes in color. And I don't think that all modern architecture is bad, not at all. There are ways that you can make it relate to what humans love. And then, of course, materials. Just like everybody else, I hate stucco, but it's a reality of building, because building is so expensive in the Bay Area. Some amount of less expensive materials are just a fact of life. But that doesn't mean that you can't have nicer materials in really important places. And there's a whole variety of materials that can be used. It doesn't all just have to be brick or mission tiles or anything like that. There can be a lot of creativity in how things are detailed to make nice buildings. And then I think it's everyone's responsibility to engage early, as you all are doing now, to plan smart and really think about the long term, not just about what's the immediate problems that are happening now. Think about the vision for the city for 25, 50 years down the line. And once you have agreed upon a plan, build that plan out. One of the issues with working in California is that once everyone has agreed to a plan, there are lots of ways that individual projects get held up, even though they conform with what's been agreed to. So now is the most important time to participate in a process like this. And then San Mateo has already been doing really great work with the Sustainable Streets plan and starting to envision streets that work for everyone. And there's the pedestrian plan that's been done recently as well, where more space is given over to humans and bikes, but still accommodating the traffic volumes that are anticipated. And then, like I mentioned before, it's really, really important to think in the long term and aspire to being a great city. It's already a great city, and think about how it can contribute to the long-term health of not only San Mateo, but the cities that it's connected to. So, of course, the most important question, what's in it for you? As I mentioned before, I think one of the most important things is this idea of choice and opportunity. Cities are going to change, and the greatest opportunity I see there is to have more choice and opportunity for people. And that can be tied in with healthy lifestyles, making places that are better to walk and bike in, improving commutes, having a really strong sense of community and diversity, and then a sustainable economy. Thank you.
One thing I will say is, in addition, I grew up in the peninsula. I spent a lot of time in San Mateo. So it actually gives me a pretty interesting perspective now that I'm in Redwood City, in an area that I grew up, to see the change that's occurring and be able to reflect on it as an area that I was in as a kid. So the Redwood City Downtown Precise Plan, I think most of you probably have been to downtown Redwood City lately, seen a lot of changes, in particular over the last 5 years. What's interesting, though, is that although a lot of development and a lot of changes have occurred over the last 5 years, this plan is over 2 decades in the making. Some background, everyone probably knows this. What's interesting, though, is we are celebrating our 150th anniversary as a city. We were founded in 1867, so there's a lot of talk about historic buildings and reflecting on how change today is contrasted to the buildings of yesterday and the buildings that were built 150 years ago. So in the 1990s, there was a general consensus that something had to be done in Redwood City. Downtown really wasn't a place, didn't have a place to go. There weren't people living down there. There weren't people going to restaurants down there. There was a good business here, or a good restaurant there too, but there really wasn't a lot of people going downtown. There was a jail downtown. So when you don't have, and it's important, when you don't, as a county seat, that's one of the things you have. You have a jail downtown. But if you don't have the critical mass of people downtown to offset the people that are coming and going from jail, it could create a dangerous environment. There were times in the 90s when there was curfews held, where youth couldn't be out at a certain time downtown. So take a look at, there was pretty much no investment in the downtown for decades. As you could see, during the 60s and 70s, there was some housing built. However, during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the only housing that was built was subsidized by the city, was subsidized by the Redevelopment Association. And some residents said, hey, we want to start seeing some economic activity down here. We want to start seeing some restaurants and shops to be able to go here. So step one was really, there was a consensus that there was a problem that had to be solved. A community group formed. There were many meetings, very similar to meetings here that we're holding tonight. I wasn't with Redwood City at the time, but I do remember that process going on. Step two, there were really 3 pillars that the Downtown Precise Plan process was built on. The first is that downtown should be a neighborhood itself. There should be people living down there. The second is that Redwood City should build on some of the strengths. The Fox Theater's down there. It had been historically the county seat. It should become the cultural and entertainment hub of the peninsula. And finally, that since the city is 150 years old now, there's a lot of historic buildings there. There's over 3 dozen historic buildings there. And any new development should respect that historic development. So the first was actually before. The Precise Plan itself was adopted in 2011. But before that, there was the Redevelopment Association, and there was a general consensus that we want to start creating public spaces. Even before we create this downtown precise plan, we want to start creating some public spaces. So this was an annex building out in front of the courthouse that's in downtown Redwood City that was built in the late 30s as a WPA program. Okay looking building, but it was hiding what is it was a really awesome plaza in front of the courthouse that had been historically used as a gathering space. And right when that opened up, that was really what started, that kick-started people coming downtown, Friday night concerts. We get thousands of people that come down every Friday night to see shows there. People see their neighbors. It really, the goal of the city was that downtown should become Redwood City's living room. Theater Way is another place. This was something that wasn't as traditional. There were some historic buildings right around it. However, this is something that was created during the 60s and 70s and 80s. The popular thing to do was take a movie theater and stick it on the other side of the freeway so that all anyone could do was just drive there, not have, maybe get a hot dog there, at the concession stand and eat, but really not have a dining and entertainment experience. The council got the city and the city council got Century to abandon the Century Park 12, which was on the other side of the other side of the 101, and move a 20-screen movie theater downtown. And that was the first major draw to the downtown area. Fox Theater has seen a renaissance. This was also shown as one of the assets downtown. A great looking building, historically had been a place that people come to, but it had gone through some rough years as people weren't going to the downtown area. It had been abandoned, had been closed up for some time. A new owner had taken it over and started to get people to go there again. Step 4 was creating a structure for private investment, and that's the Redwood City Downtown Precise Plan. At that time, as you could see from that previous slide, no one was really investing in the downtown area or anywhere in Redwood City at that point. There wasn't, other than Redwood Shores, that's where most of the development had occurred in the 70s and 80s and 90s. What this document set out to do was create certainty, and really certainty on two ends. Certainty, first and foremost, for the residents that participated in the process, that the development that was occurring was going to look a specific way, and certainty on the private investment end that if they were to build a building, there would be a path that they could go through for approval. So some architects don't love this document at first because in total there's about 1,000 standards and guidelines. There is some flexibility in which standards and guidelines. There's 6 different architectural styles that you could choose. But in terms of a very prescriptive document because it went through a decade-long process. And we wanted to make sure that the plan was actually what we were planning to do. So one of the major things was building height. Now, downtown Redwood City actually had allowed buildings over 100 feet for decades. However, not much had been built other than the county courthouse, which was built out to about 140 feet. And I'll say from the start is, as I'm saying this and saying what Redwood City's downtown precise plan is, this is specific to Redwood City. San Mateo or whichever city is going through a specific plans process should find the height that's right for that city, find the height that's right for that context. So what we decided in Redwood City is that the tallest building wasn't going to be taller than the tallest building that already existed in downtown Redwood City. And we also decided that the areas that were closest to residential were going to be the areas with the smallest buildings. So it was almost like a wedding cake design where you have the tallest buildings in the middle and they fanned out, and then you have 3-story buildings that are closer to the residential areas. And this will show you some of the, in some areas you might be able to have 3 stories on the street side, and then you have to step it back further away. You could step it back and go up higher as you go further away from the street and further away from the single-family homes. These same step backs are required when you're near historic properties, and these same step backs occur when you're near our 2 main retail streets, which is Broadway as well as Main Street in downtown. The second relates to use regulations. Here we went for a more form-based code, where similar to what Amit was speaking about, where we took a look at what do we want the building to look like, what do we want the height to be, what do we want the step backs to be, but the total number of units you put in there wasn't going to be prescribed. We also took uses from different areas. And I will admit, we have had to make some tweaks in this plan, and I'll have a slide on that, because as you're going through a process, you're not going to get 100% things right. And the market's going to change, and things that you predicted were going to happen don't come to fruition. So you may have to make sure while you stick with your vision and you stick true to that vision, don't be afraid to make tweaks along the way if those are necessary. Key design standards. 6 different designs allowed, everything from very traditional neoclassical architecture to more contemporary modern architecture. We took an approach rather than saying you could have 100 units on this property or 50 dwelling units for every acre on this property, to looking at our overall downtown area, which is over 100 acres, and saying within this downtown area, you could have up to 2,500 residential units, up to 500,000 square feet of net new office space, 200 hotel rooms, and 100,000 square feet of retail space. This did 2 things. Number one, it gave us a project to study from the California Environmental Quality Act standpoint, so we knew exactly what the total projections would be for traffic, for different types of impacts downtown, and it also made certain that there was going to be a balanced out of uses. What I will say, if we didn't have these caps and there was more flexibility, there would have been less housing and more office, because there was such a demand for office space that office space would have outpriced housing when people were bidding for it. So that's one thing to pay attention to, is what do you want the balance to be of different uses in your downtown area. So the step 5 is really just fortunate timing. 2011 was the year that the plan was adopted after over a decade of community outreach. There was a lawsuit involved that further delayed it. But the economy came back right around that time. Economy, like in San Mateo and all of San Mateo County, is about 3%. Ongoing housing shortage. And what we've seen is just an unprecedented demand for office and housing space near transit. Now, you've probably heard the term transit-oriented development thrown around, and that's often a very polarizing term, because usually you hear kind of 2 camps. You hear a lot of advocates that say everyone's going to take transit. You know, that's not true. Then you have another camp that says no one's going to take transit. You always have to drive your car no matter where you are. That's not true either. What we've seen so far is that there's been a substantial reduction in the number of trips compared to single-family homes or compared to office space in Redwood Shores, for example. I'll give one example. The Box Building, which is the largest building that's right next to the Redwood City train station, 300,000 square feet of office space. There's about 1,500 employees there, 900 parking spaces. 300 of those parking spaces are vacant every day. So even though the parking spaces are there, people are not actually driving. Now, there's a number of factors to that. Box and the other tech companies that work there have very aggressive transportation demand management programs. They buy their employees' train passes. It's also quicker to get on the train with a baby bullet coming from San Francisco or San Jose into downtown Redwood City. It's a 1-minute walk to their work from the train station. 101's horrible, so they don't want to take 101. So, I mean, there are a number of factors, but the truth is, it is working. In fact, some of the projections that we had for total there's about 40% less trips that we're seeing from these offices than we even predicted within the environmental document. And similar on the residential side, anywhere from 30 to 60% as we're starting to going back and what we're calling auditing these developments to see what traffic is really like coming from these. So here's some market forces. As you can see, the developers are actually marketing these as a quick train trip down from San Francisco and San Jose, comparing us to the other cities and how long it takes to get there. This is the Box Building that I spoke about. This is the largest building. This reaches about 130 feet, right next to the train station. This is 196 units. This is interesting because I spoke to the step back after the third story. As you can see, as along the street, it goes up 3 stories, and then it steps back, and then it goes up additional stories. And what the builder has done has used that space for residential amenities. So that's where there's a dog run up there, there's gardens, there's different seating areas, so there's actually outdoor areas, and there's actually great views from there as well. This is one of my favorite buildings. This is about 130 units, probably about somewhere around 100 units an acre, 150 units an acre. And you could see that when you hear those numbers thrown around, that seems like a lot. You know, single-family homes are usually 8 dwelling units per acre. So that's a lot more than we're used to in the suburbs. But you can see this building really isn't an intimidating building still at that density. These are some new office buildings. This is one is under construction right now across the street from the box building. This one backs up to the historic Fox Theater and respected, step back towards the back to respect that. This is an affordable housing development. One thing I will say is another tweak that we made that I'll get into is we amended the plan to require that some of the 2,500 units downtown be affordable, at least 15% of them. This is a lot that the city owned for about 10 years, and we have 117 affordable senior units proposed there. This is a Habitat for Humanity project. This is actually a very dense project, but it's only on a 2,500 square foot lot, and there's about 20 affordable home ownership units that are going to be built on this. So step 6 was implementation. What I will say is implementation is difficult. For everyone that's in this room right now, there'll be 10 times as many people involved once a building starts going up that's consistent with the plan. So it does really take some community will and political will to get through the implementation phase. And you also, thank you, and you also have to, as I'll get to in my next slide, not be afraid to make tweaks of the plan when you realize the plan could be improved. But the deeper the roots of the plan, the more you're able to go through this. And really be genuine. You know, the council tells us as staff and as I tell my staff, really listen. If someone just says they don't like the plan, really listen to the reasons why they don't like the plan and see how you can make changes to make it better. So what are some of the policy changes that we made? The first is we've created a community benefit program, which we've somewhat incorporated into this first phase through affordable housing, but we'll definitely include in the second phase, and I'll get more into that. We strengthened ground floor retail requirements. When this plan was adopted in 2011, there was 30% vacancy of office space throughout Redwood City. Now there's less than 3% downtown. What that caused was in areas where we allowed some flexibility between from office and retail on the ground floors, office was just simply outbidding retail. They were paying $7 a square foot where retail pays $3 a square foot. And we heard from the community they wanted to see more retail ground floor, so we amended the plan to require retail in certain locations. We've increased the level of review. There was a thought that since it's gone through 10 years, let's have staff level review of certain developments. Well, like I said, there's 10 times more people involved now that the plan has been adopted. They wanted to see higher level of reviews, and as staff and the City Council and the Planning Commission was fine with that. We said instead of staff level reviews and approvals, we'll kick that up to the Planning Commission. We're looking at balancing architectural styles. There's 6 different architectural styles allowed. Certain architectural styles out the gate, there's been more of those, so we're seeing how we could tweak the plan to have more balance of styles downtown. And we're aiming to create additional open space and green space. Now, we have a great courthouse square, but we don't have a park downtown. Now, there's a lot of criticism about that. Now, why didn't you have a park downtown? Well, parks cost a lot of money, and both to build and to maintain. And City of Redwood City did not have those funds to build that park on the time. But fortunately, we've had a park impact fee that we've taken in from the developments, and we have about $20 million that we've collected now from these developments downtown. And we started a process where we're looking at identifying a space for downtown to both build a park. Since then, since the property owners are doing really well now, they've created a business improvement district where they tax themselves additional funds to help maintain the downtown, and those funds will help go to assist the city in maintaining this park. So taxpayer funds won't be used as heavily for this park, and taxpayer funds won't be used to make this downtown park. So here's one, business improvement district. We're also looking at closing down additional streets. There's a lot of pedestrian activity here. Theater Way, which is that small street, just a lot of people walking up and down the street as they go from the train station to the courthouse or they go over to the movie theater. We're having a trial right now where we've closed it down. I'll tell you, as a planning director, most decisions that you make, at least 50% of the people hate the decision that you make in general. This is one of the few decisions that we've made that there's almost a true consensus that this is better for Redwood City, that people enjoy working there. They're not worried about their teenage kids walking down and getting hit by a speeding car. As you can see, it's also allowed additional seating area during lunchtime. The Business Improvement District has bought umbrellas and chairs, and people are actually sitting down and eating there. So in terms of community benefits, so this term is thrown around a lot. And what it basically means is, okay, first of all, when the Redwood City Downtown Precise Plan was adopted, there was a redevelopment association, and there may be some people here who are familiar with this, but essentially what it meant is when you increase property taxes, the increase in property tax that you receive, you get a keep for your city, and you get it put back in that area. It was the greatest local community benefit program there's been in the history of California. Unfortunately, it was eliminated 6 months after this plan was adopted. So what we're looking at now, another term for community benefits is value capture. And what it's essentially saying, when you're taking your zoning and making it X and you're, let's say, creating more density, that's an increased value for that property owner. So how much can you extract from that value and put back towards the community? Now, it's not endless. You know, sometimes I hear folks saying, why don't we make them do this, that, and this? And development would never occur. There would no be private investment because in the end, people are investing because they want a return on their investment. So you really have to look at, you know, what are the project costs, what are land costs, what's the required profit, and do a land use economic analysis that says, with those two, hey, there's still a remainder that we could extract. Now, what plays into that remainder are really two things. What are the economic conditions at the time? Hot market right now, a lot of value. There's more that you could extract. When you have, you know, if we were in 2008, there really wouldn't be anything to extract because people weren't investing at the same time. Zoning capacity and uncertainty. So if you downzone properties, you're not going to have as much to take out for community benefits. So that's something you have to consider as well. And in the end, it really is when you're taking a look at your, the way we structured it is, our community benefit program is we're increasing fees for things that we know we want. So we increase fees for housing, increase fees for parks, increase fees for art. We have a second benefit, what we call on-site community improvements. This is for bigger areas, not in particular for a downtown area, but for example, the old Malibu side along the 101, where, you know, it's about 25 acres. There should be some on-site community benefits there. There should be some intrinsic value to the development itself that the community could benefit from. And the third is a community fund. So, you know, how do we have an ongoing, a lot of the nonprofits have lost funding because of redevelopment and cuts to community development block grants. How can we continue to fund those through this community fund? So, as you could see, since then, we've had a lot of development of housing downtown. 60s, 70s, nothing much. 2000s, all subsidized. Since 2011, we've had, it's not a total of 2,372 built. There's about 1,500 or so that have been built and about 800 that are in the pipeline. And there's over 200 of those are affordable units with very little subsidy from the city, almost nothing. So other things, some stats. These are a little bit old, but as you can see, the downtown's doing a lot better. Now, one question I get is, why didn't you just stop after you built the courthouse square, you built the movie theater? And the truth is, in Redwood City, the businesses, the restaurants that Redwood City residents enjoy couldn't survive just based on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday evening dining experiences. They really needed to have a critical mass of people there during the daytime, a critical mass of people living there and walking to it to really survive and create the kind of restaurants that people both in Greater Redwood City and throughout the peninsula want to visit. A lot of people going down here. So we're in a good place now. Now, that's not to say that there's not growing pains. That's not to say that a lot of folks don't like what's going on. But I will say overall, as someone who grew up in the area, Redwood City is a lot better place now than it was. It can continue to improve, and we will continue to improve it by creating iterative policy changes. But as I would say, aim high within your precise plan, and don't be afraid to tweak it along the way during implementation. So here's my contact information if you have any questions.
I think the most important design tool is massing, and massing is how much carving there is in a building. Let's say you have a rectangle that's extruded up. If you can make more cuts out of the building and have it at a smaller scale, that's the most important design strategy you can use. Material is important, color is important, and window details are important. But the most important thing to regulate and to advocate for is for massing reduction in the building.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, based on the reaction we've got, we have 12 or so buildings that have come online. The buildings that do have the greatest both horizontal and vertical articulation, the switching it up the most, both from a horizontal and vertical standpoint, are the ones where there's a general consensus that those fit in the best. The ones that are larger and don't have as much articulation don't get as uniform a reaction.
I think when you're putting a new building directly next to a historic building, you want the new building to almost fade away into the background. I have concerns as a general strategy about replication of historic buildings into new buildings, because it's hard to make the new stuff look as good as the old stuff. It's completely different building techniques and technologies. So you might as well embrace that and do a building type that's more authentic, but it sort of recedes in the background, whether it's stepped back in relationship to the historic building, or it steps down in relation to the historic building, or there's landscaping or other ways to camouflage the new building that's adjacent to the historic resource.
Yeah, I think overall, step backs are great, because in general, historic buildings, for the most part, aren't going to be as tall as some of the newer buildings that are coming online. I agree. I hear from folks that a lot of times say you should replicate that architectural style. I don't think that's a great idea. I think we're building a building at a point in time, and I think the goal should be that as you're, 50 years from now, as you're walking down, you could say, oh, cool, that building was built in 1925. This building was built in 2017, and you could see how your town has progressed throughout the years, and you're not just copying things from years past, but at the same time, respecting it and being compatible with it.
Okay. I'm concerned that it seems to me that, Aaron, if a developer came and said to Redwood City and said, we want to hire Frank Geary or Santiago Calatrava to build a fabulous building, that you would say, sorry, it's not among the 7 approved architects. And that seems to me to be a huge loss.
Yeah, I think you could be right. I think any policy document is going to have trade-offs, and if you do want that much flexibility, the problem is also going to be that you might get the opposite of Frank Gehry coming in and building, wanting to propose a very ugly building. So, that's something every city has to make that decision, and I think Redwood City fell on that. We want to stick with these 7 different architectural styles.
Redwood City.
So I think I touched on some of them. I think that, for example, the not forecasting that redevelopment was going to go away, and that the redevelopment had a 15% affordability requirement to it, and that went away. So it took us a few years to get on our feet and adjust the caps to require that affordability. The retail example, not forecasting that office space was going to roar back in the way it did over those years, and being a little bit late to the game and changing and tweaking ours to require some of the retail on the ground floor. So those are two, the level of review. I think that, I wasn't there when the plan was adopted, but I think the staff that was there at the time and the city council that was there and the community groups saw all these people participating and said, hey, there's going to be a consensus as this is implemented because everyone in this room has gone through this process. I think underestimated the number of people that will come out when they see that first building coming up. And so that staff level of review probably wasn't appropriate. Have more of a public hearing type review, a planning commission type review where public comment could be taken.
As more and more people shop online, retailers are going out of business. So I'm just wondering, how do you anticipate the demand for retail in the future during the planning process?
So I'll answer that. First, restaurant is kind of the new retail. And, spaces that, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that were retail space have now converted to restaurants. So when I say the word retail, it's actually a more umbrella term of traditional retail, restaurants, some personal services, health clubs, things like that. So we use the term, it's a very planning term, like active uses, active storefront uses. So things where it's not someone pulling down the blinds and sitting in their cube and coding for 12 hours in the day. There's actually people going in and out of the store. So I do think, and I do think that, there's a lot of folks that hope that retail is going to come back in a way where I don't think it's going to come back in that way. But I do think we have enough flexibility where the spaces will fill up with restaurants that are doing really well, some personal services that are doing real well, and things like that.
You also mentioned that having people who live there
Yeah.
and work there,
Yeah.
more people in downtown is a way to really support that retail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another thing. It's just when you have, we're going to have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people living downtown now. You have a built-in customer base that you didn't have before. Now the question is, can that support, your traditional shoe store? Probably not over the long run because everyone goes to Zappos. But, you will support restaurants and things like that.
Amit, did you have some thoughts over time?
Sure. In a lot of cities, retail is thought of, there's almost too much retail. It's just sort of a default that you go to. But there are, if you have, let's say, 17 feet from floor to floor, within that space you can have a townhouse, you can have loft units, you can have commercial office spaces, and you can have retail spaces. So making sure that the ground floor is tall enough to accommodate these types of uses, allowing those different types of uses to occur over time, and having that flexibility is really important. And then as far as making retail itself successful, things like having good lighting and awnings and transparency and clear entryways and recesses at the doors, all these little details are what make retail successful. Having bike racks and good paving and landscaping, that's what we all love about cities. And that's what we mostly experience.
Back here by the door.
Kind of a follow-on to this previous question. Is there any holistic planning that goes into the overall mix of retail / restaurants / general things that are available to the public? I'm interested specifically in San Mateo, but generally about the planning process.
So, I mean, in general, you could have your zoning be as specific that you want it to be, but in the end, it doesn't mean you're going to get those businesses to come in. You might control the market a little bit because you're lowering the overall rents by limiting the amount of uses that compete for that space. But there's some, for example, I grew up in San Carlos. During the 90s, there was too many nail salons along, and so they zoned out nail salons there. So there are specific things you could do. Now, the problem with that is that there's grandfather clauses. So, if you might have too many of one use, those are grandfathered in, and it's really difficult to get rid of those spaces. And in the end, the real problem is they're surviving because people are going there, and there is a customer base for them.
I really appreciated your presentations. Thank you. I worked in Mission Bay and saw a lot of buildings come up in Mission Bay. I work in Foster City and saw a lot of buildings come up there. You see one building with this certain style. It looks awesome. See two, you see a pattern, then you see everything kind of looking the same. So what, as a community member, can I do to start kind of advocating or, ensuring that we have a variety? I think Redwood City has done a really lovely job with that, so that's my question.
So I could take, from a standards standpoint, number one, I would say, use photos as you're making your case and show actual buildings that you like and how you would like to see. And it is true. What you'll see is that there may be, 3 or 4 architectural firms that design a lot of these buildings that are being built because they work with certain developers or they work with certain investors and they kind of replicate some of their design. But to the extent that your city has some control, I would incorporate those in some design guidelines and then make sure there's some policies that say we'd like to see a balance of styles.
I also think
The thing about Mission Bay and even the historic buildings here in San Mateo, they are built within a certain amount of time. They all kind of look the same, and it's of their time. So Mission Bay has other issues with like block size and having very consistent building heights and the sizes of the buildings.
Sinking buildings.
Sinking buildings, yes, that. But and they also kind of scraped the whole rail yards clean there. There was nothing to really hold on to except for that one little historic building. So the more we can kind of make things messy, it will make a better neighborhood.
I'm wondering, from their professional perspective, how do they see San Mateo in itself, and which could be the first 3 important things that they will have to get done here, if they can give us their point of view?
I'm not presently working on any projects in San Mateo, and I'll be honest, I don't know that much about San Mateo specifically. So I think lots of casinos, that's the way to go.
What do you mean?
I think
Yeah.
you're
So
more familiar.
it's hard for me to say too. As someone who's the community development director in the next big San Mateo city over, it's hard for me to comment. But I would say is that I think the things that people enjoy most in downtown Redwood City are some of the public spaces that we have in our downtown area. We have Courthouse Square. We've closed down Theater Way now, and I think we're going to do that permanently, and people really enjoy those areas. I think housing is an issue that we all have to deal with in San Mateo County, so focusing on housing, I think, is a good thing. Whether we like it or not, the state puts certain requirements on us to produce housing, and I think downtown in an area near your train station is the best place to put it. Now, all that said, you don't have as many parcels as we do. And Redwood City is just geographically just a different city than San Mateo is. So there's not as many, I would say, opportunity sites as Redwood City has. But I think building on housing and having people live downtown is always a good thing.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that having a diversity of units is really, really important. And in San Francisco, in certain neighborhoods, there's a requirement for 40% of the units to be 2-bedroom units or 30% to be 3-bedroom units. And so that automatically builds in larger units that families can occupy. Unfortunately, what's happened is that because of the really strong economy, those larger units are being subletted out amongst several roommates. There might be a couple living in one of the bedrooms in a 3-bedroom unit, and several other people as well. So over the long term, it's good to build these large units and require them. And from a developer's perspective, they can be as valuable from a revenue generating standpoint as a bunch of studio units. But yeah, it's important to have that built into the buildings for the long term as the market changes.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is, yeah, that is something that's tricky to deal with. What we are seeing to some degree, there mostly is younger people, millennials, living in these units. A lot of them actually work in downtown Redwood City, and they walk to work since we're building some office space, and there's existing office space there. We have started to see some people who, one, I won't say major issue, but one issue is there's a lot of single-family homes of people that have lived there for 40, 50 years, and where traditionally those were used by single families. They're no longer larger families there. So what we've seen is some baby boomers moving down to downtown area, then that frees up the single family house that they had previously lived in.
Can you please discuss eminent domain in the Redwood City case? Any expenses incurred by the city defending lawsuits against council they have to fight and pay to keep the eminent domain going if there was?
So this is way before my time. Around 2003 or so, there was one eminent domain case that did go to court. I don't remember the result of it, but yeah, the city did end up spending some money, not only purchasing it, but defending the eminent domain usage. Now, the eminent domain law has changed since then. I think politically, eminent domain isn't as used as much as it was throughout California as it was 15 years ago. But yeah, anytime you go through an eminent domain case, you're going to spend money both fighting it in court if you don't get agreed upon price in the up front.
We here at San Mateo, we have growing pains too. So you literally experienced a 10-year period in which you started with these buildings going higher and making the older buildings and newer buildings cohesive. So some of the financial problems here in San Mateo for the new developers is the actual additional costs that it is costing us now to redevelop our streets, our sewers, our just everything in that, the trees, the sidewalks, because in the more historical area, below Delaware, out to the freeway, there are really no sidewalks or little where the trees go. So all of that area has to be redeveloped by the developer. Also the sewers, all of them. So can you give me a little bit of insight? How did the city of Redwood City, as fast as you can, work with that problem as far as financially and developing TPA standards and stuff?
So I think the short answer is the density allowed in the downtown Redwood City precise plan, even though the developer has to upgrade the sewers in the immediate area, upgrade the sidewalks, it still pencils out for them. So if if you don't allow certain densities, then it's not, the sidewalks won't get upgraded because it just won't be enough return on profit for the developer to make. Now, that said, it's also in our downtown area, the city council with the redevelopment association had spent some money already upgrading some of the sidewalks downtown. Not all of them, most, and I do get in debates, for lack of a better word, with developers about what they have to upgrade, and they do, fight on some of it. But in the end, it really is in the end, those costs are typically passed on to the existing property owner through lower land value, not really developer profits. So the question is, even with all these things that you're requiring them to do, will that existing property owner still sell their property? So if they're no longer getting $5 million in for their property, they're getting $4 million because $1 million has to be spent on infrastructure upgrades. Is that enough to make the development still keep on going? So that's really an economic analysis that you most likely will do with a planning document to see that will these type of things still pencil? Will this plan come to fruition?
Thank you.
Over here.
Amit, great presentation. Aaron, that was awesome. I gotta say, I love your picture of the 4-story building in the small-sized town. I love that for our downtown. Aaron, your presentation, we went to Redwood City last week for a movie. I gotta say, I had a little bit of downtown envy. That plaza's awesome, and the closed street is really incredible with all the ground floor retail. Love what you're saying about the historic district and whatnot. My question for you is specifically around transparency. And I think transparency breeds accountability and ferrets out undesirable elements. And I think there's an opportunity for us here in San Mateo to perhaps benefit from things that you did or maybe didn't do in the way of transparency. For example, there are 3 tracks to this downtown program, only one of which the public is part of, which seems a little obfuscatory, if that's a word. And then we have things like this where it says increased height density is a top 5 priority, when in the survey it comes in at 8 and only had about 15% support. Seems misleading at best. So what did you do to include the public in this process and ensure that things were as transparent as possible?
So So I wasn't there when the plan was adopted, but I mean, what I will say is, in general, I would say there's kind of 4 different things that, that are criticized in any plan policy adoption policy. There's the policy itself. And you're always going to have debate on the policy itself. Then there's the process that you go through, and you should work together, even if you disagree on things, on the process itself to make sure it's a fair process. Then there's the data or the methodology that you use, and you should be making sure that you're making decisions on sound data. And then there's the people portion of are you giving within city staff, for example, I said, as I touched on in my presentation, once you adopt that planning document, the planning document isn't done. The implementation is part of the planning phase, so you're still engaging community. So I would say, to where you think that there's flaws, or where you believe that there's flaws, I mean, talk to city staff directly, work through those issues. You may not always agree on the process itself, but at least keep that dialogue going.
What are you most proud of, and how Redwood City has handled the increased traffic from people and cars, and where do you feel like you could have done more?
So I think I'm most proud of, or maybe the word's relieved, that the things that we said were going to occur in terms of people's traffic patterns have actually come to fruition. People are actually not driving as much as they would in single-family homes, dramatically less. People are actually living and working downtown. People are actually taking the train at record numbers and walking to their work. The thing that we haven't done yet that I want to start doing, that we're working towards, we actually have a citywide transportation plan where we're trying to coordinate our transportation strategies throughout the downtown area, is forming some type of transportation management association for a downtown area. I think the bigger employers do a pretty good job at giving train passes, but there's some smaller startups or mid-sized companies that just don't have the number of people within the organization to make that pencil. And if we have some association downtown that helps coordinate that, I think we could even improve those numbers even greater.
He talked about downtown envy, and I see in those priorities there nothing about improving our making San Mateo a little bit like Redwood City in terms of a cultural mecca. I've lived in San Mateo 20 years. There's been a lot of congestion. There's been a lot of development in the last 20 years, and there's nothing else going on hardly to do here. And I'm not that young, it's not like, so I'm wondering, how do you incorporate those priorities in the plan when you don't have a courthouse space that you could already work with? We don't have Fox Theater, but we do have the park, and there are buildings in the park that are really underutilized, I think. And how can we just attract more culture here so that all the great groups don't just bypass San Mateo and go to Palo Alto and then Santa Cruz, and they skip us every time?
So I think the first thing is really, one thing that San Mateo has that Redwood City doesn't have is you have Central Park right there. I mean, that's an awesome park to have adjacent to your downtown area. And I mean, I personally live in the Peninsula, come to events at Central Park all the time, and I actually go to downtown San Mateo a lot as well. So I mean, really, like we identified Theater Way and said, hey, this is a street that we want to close down because we want to see more activity here. Start to look in the downtown area and start to identify places where you could either shut down streets temporarily to have different type of activities, or even take the leap and over time maybe shut down a certain segment of street permanently so that it's only open to pedestrians and you could have activities there.
I want to build on that just for a second. It's important to try small experiments like that, just to test them out and see if they work. And it's a pretty low risk way of being creative with downtown.
Yeah, there's a little bit of rhapsodizing about how you can do things so that things kind of match up in a historical area, to make sure things don't stick out. Well, we've got contiguous buildings all in a row for like 2 blocks, as you folks did. What's happening like with your historic, like Broadway, where all those historic buildings are? What do you think is wise for us to do in terms of preserving versus kind of patchwork, yucky looking B Street? It's a very special street.
Okay. Oh, you want me to? Okay. So I mean, yeah. So the historic buildings that you have, you're probably not going to touch any of those historic buildings because there's some buildings that are going to be protected from a California Environmental Quality Act standpoint, and you'll have to I doubt some of the historic buildings are going anywhere. But for the other ones, I mean, there are, for example, I think Main Street's an area within Redwood City where it's actually our only historic street district, where we have an old Oddfellows building, we have a number of other historic buildings. What we did in this area, and we do have a development site that's like right in the middle of different, and actually incorporates one of the historic buildings. So we have very specific guidelines that say when you're next to a historic building, you need to, it's a 3-story height maximum, you need to step back. You need to keep at least 75% of that building if you're incorporating it into the development itself. So we have some where they're actually incorporating the historic facade, then setting back a newer portion of the development, so that as you're walking down the street, you still walk inside this historic building, but there's almost an annex portion of it in back that's built onto.
Seems an important thing for our town. Very important.
Your focus has been on, local design and planning, which is understandable, Redwood City and San Mateo. Considering the fact that so many people, live elsewhere, come in for work in San Mateo, or live in San Mateo, work elsewhere, it seems like there's a big regional planning issue as well. And I wonder if you can comment upon how city planning about the design in San Mateo interacts with regional planning, which includes majorly transportation. Right now, El Camino is really a second 101. It's really busy many, many times. And so therefore, I wonder what impact the city of San Mateo has upon better infrastructure for transportation, which affects the whole region. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, San Mateo is really special, but every city thinks they're very special. And there really is no regional planning authority in the Bay Area that has the authority to do regional level improvements with transportation. So I'm not sure quite how to answer this, but every city has a responsibility to think about its neighbors, how it fits in the overall picture, take on the responsibility to do your own fair share. And in Redwood City, one of our employees in my company, SITELAB, just moved to Redwood City. She works in San Francisco, takes Caltrain up, and her husband works in Cupertino. And he was tired of driving down to Cupertino every day or taking the bus. And there are many communities in the peninsula that are ideally located for these sort of split commuter households. And change is inevitable, and embrace the change and get benefit out of it. So that goes back to my question before, what's in it for you? Try to figure out how to address the larger needs, but make sure that there are benefits for this community as well, and keep the good stuff that's here already.
So can I ask a follow-up question then is, does San Mateo or Redwood City have any leverage to implement more of a regional planning strategy rather than individual city-by-city planning? It seems not ideal.
Yeah. I mean, to some degree. I mean, I think something that we share really three things. Similar to what Amit was talking about, is we're both. The Mid-Peninsula is unique in that we have our own kind of employment area, and we're smack dab in the middle between two bigger employment areas, Silicon Valley and San Francisco. I think that we are starting to coordinate together in terms of that generally all the plans, especially the larger cities, have plans where having higher density housing near the train station, and I think that's a smart thing to do from a transportation standpoint. The third thing is, and I think that we could do better over the long run, is coordinate how we get traffic up and down El Camino. And I think as we all have transportation, I know that San Mateo has transportation and management associations, but as all of these cities have transportation management associations and they mature, is how do we get those to start coordinating together throughout the Mid-Peninsula?
I know San Mateo downtown well. I was the first director of our business district. We have a beautiful, almost the most beautiful retail building on the peninsula on 3rd Avenue. and our city allowed someone to take it over as a school. It has no one going in and out. It has a huge space for events. It could be a club. It could be used so many incredible ways. How do we get our city to listen to the fact that we have a dead space in the most beautiful building on 3rd Avenue, a lovely old retail building? How did the citizens, everybody I know who lives near downtown, I do, was outraged at that. We all notified the city. Nobody wanted that to happen. Did that ever happen in Redwood City where somebody said, don't tear down the building in front of the courthouse, or, you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not that specific. Actually, we're going through this. Schools, number one, are very difficult to locate. So, in terms of where, and I hear what you're saying.
Elementary school.
Yeah. In terms of active and inactive uses, I think that's a conversation that you have to have through this planning process. And similar to what I was speaking about on Main Street, there's a lot of people that are upset, both with us as staff and the city council, that there's these nice older retail buildings that were converted to office space and are dead space now on Main Street. So I think that you have to have some type of policy that, as you identify things that you don't want within a certain area, if there is a consensus and the city council agrees that that's the way to go, that you incorporate that within the zoning code itself. Now, I will say it's very difficult to get rid of uses once they occupy that building. There is technically ways to amortize them out over time, but it's a costly, thing to do. But I think, incorporate measures within the zoning code is the most important thing.
Over here?
I heard only one mention of affordable housing, and I know Redwood City doesn't have very much among the new housing. And what is possible for San Mateo to create more affordable family housing?
So I'll just chime in the rail corridor area where we developed in the city of San Mateo. We've had entitled or approved or under construction approximately 2,200 dwelling units, and of those 2,200 dwelling units, approximately 20% are below market rate units. Now, could there be more? Certainly there could be more, but I think, as Aaron was indicating, different communities do things differently. One of the things that, and I know some of you were here when Measure H was first passed, there is an affordable housing requirement that has been mandated since the 1990s.
Yeah, but there's a wide range of affordable housing, wide range, at 30%, 50% income, so there's a really wide range. So you have to be aware of what type of affordable housing is like.
So one thing that we did in Redwood City is we don't have an inclusionary housing ordinance, but because we don't have the measure, so we're subject to some state level decisions that were made. We adopted an affordable housing impact fee. This was a redevelopment area before, so we expected 15% to be affordable. Unfortunately, the first 1,500 units got out the gate and there was virtually no affordable units. However, since that time, the last 800 units in the downtown area that have gone through the entitlement process have about 27% affordability. That's a combination of inclusionary housing that we've got through the community benefits negotiation process, and the city's put city-owned parcels out to nonprofit developers to build affordable housing there. And in terms of how deep the level of affordability is, so without going in, so there's different levels of affordability, which probably a lot of people in this room know. There's what's called moderate affordable housing. That goes up to about 120%. People who earn 120% of the area median income could afford that. So that's actually pretty expensive. That's about $2,500 or so ballpark for a two-bedroom. Our council focused in the downtown area on 80% area median income and below. So so the units are going to range between, probably for two bedrooms, anywhere between 1,000 and 1,600, something around there. So a lot less than, still expensive, but a lot less than, less than half the market.
And one other thing to mention about affordable housing, over the past 30 years or so, the Bay Area has not built housing to keep up with population, the pace of population growth. So it's important to have these subsidized units, whether it's subsidized by us as taxpayers or subsidized by the developer. But it's also important to create a consistent pipeline of housing decade over decade over decade so that there's enough supply overall so it brings the prices down. The creation of market rate housing takes, I think, something like 20 years to sort of get get felt as an impact in the overall market. So you have to start now to make sure that there's affordability in the future for middle-income people.
One of the best analogies I've heard is that market rate housing is kind of like a vaccine, so that if you look 20, 30 years down the line, you don't have problems in your community. But we still have that ongoing issue of affordable housing right now, and really the subsidized affordable housing is really more of a medicine that we could use right now to help offset some of the affordability problems.
Yeah, I just want to follow up. Is there any analysis between rent control and affordable housing? You know, to the extent that you have rent control, there's certain fixed housing that doesn't get to move anywhere, right?
Yeah.
You know, so is there any analysis in the planning that goes into that, you know, variable?
Yeah, there's a lot of analysis, and it's way too much to go into. But there's definite. If you look at the research, there's definite downsides to rent control, and then there's a lot of, there is also some upsides, especially in the near term. But I think. I won't give my own opinion, but overall, there's not many cities that have rent control for really two reasons. Because of that policy debate, and also because of state-level laws that you can't apply rent control to new housing. So everything, you create two really markets. You can't apply it to things that were built after 1995. So essentially everything that was built over the last 20 years would not be rent controlled, and then you would have this other shadow market that is rent controlled. So it's, yeah. I know, yeah.
I would just make the point that number one over here, parking and traffic. I've lived here for over 40 years, and what I've noticed is just a tremendous increase in traffic. We cannot move around here at certain times of the day. I know we have 92 and 101, which is an advantage or disadvantage, but you cannot go on 92 after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it screws up Alameda, and it screws up El Camino. And so it impacts all the area around that, and it just seems like if there's more growth. I get the idea with, I'll go take the trains and stuff like that, but whatever's going on, it's getting harder and harder to drive. Everybody's got ways. They say, oh, cut here, go down there. It's impacting everywhere. And that's just my feeling about this, is it almost seems like it has to, if that doesn't factor in, it's going to get really undesirable here, because you won't go downtown. You won't be able to do it.
Yeah, I know it's a very complicated policy. Obviously the issue that we had throughout the years is that, we had huge, the slide I didn't show is in Redwood City, 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, far more growth than we've even done since 2010, double that amount. But then we essentially stopped, and what happened was you took the development first out to the 880 corridor, then you took it out to the 680 corridor, but the jobs are still in this area. So even though there wasn't really growth in this immediate area, there still was traffic growth, because and the problem there is, number one, in terms of, you're not creating transit, it's not transit optional development, you only have one option, driving your car, and you're driving at a further distance, but still into the area where the jobs are. So I hear you. I think in terms of my day-to-day job, the things that, I focus on the most, and I think the planning staff and transportation staff in San Mateo is traffic, and then affordable housing. Really, those are the two big issues that we're dealing with at this point in time.
I'll confess that I drove down here, and I parked on a free parking space on the street, and I could stay there until 8 in the morning tomorrow. I shouldn't be able to do that. That shouldn't be my first choice, or the most convenient choice for me. I should be able to take a bus, or I should be able to take the train much more easily, and it should be cheaper than having to drive here.
Yeah, staying on that, are there any markets anywhere, I'm not only in the peninsula, but anywhere that you're familiar with, where this particular type of problem is being dealt with in a more concise or manageable way? There's traffic everywhere, so are you aware of anywhere where they're solving this problem?
I don't think there's any, I don't think you'll ever really, the only way you really solve the traffic problem is high unemployment rates. That's when you solve the traffic problem. Even if you look at,
I remember the dot-com bust.
Yeah.
I remember the dot-com boom, and right after that, it was
Yeah, if you look at, Caltrans has a trove of data, and if you look at it, even if you hold, if you hold static, how much development has occurred in certain areas along those freeways, traffic pretty much goes up in the same rate dependent upon the unemployment rate. So, but in terms of, I think some of the big employers actually are doing it pretty well. I mean, if you look at what Google's doing on their campus of getting people out of their cars, even though they're not right next to a transit station, they're doing a pretty good job. Box in downtown Redwood City, they're doing a pretty good job just by locating the right land uses. But I do think the one major flaw is that although we have regional policy through Metropolitan Transportation Commission, cities do make these independent decisions that affect other cities. And I think in the long run, I think from a policy standpoint, we're going to have to come to terms with that. How do we coordinate transportation decisions?
I have a question for everybody. I live 3 blocks from here, and I also work 3 blocks from here. And I'm wondering who has been using the bicycle system that San Mateo offers to all of us at a very good rate. Can you raise your hand? Just to have an idea. Great, because I am so proud of the bicycle system. I have my own bicycle, but one time I took the train from San Francisco. I confused the train. I ended up in Hillsdale. I saw the bicycles in the station, at the train station. I took my cell phone, and in 1 minute, I opened an account, and I had a bicycle to go back to downtown San Mateo where I live. And I was just amazed. So I just wanted to encourage you that, because if we, the people who live here, are more active in using alternative transportation methods, we also can contribute to the easiness of the crowd. Just like it.
That we face here, and this may not be the case in Redwood City, because as you point out, there are very key differences between Redwood City in terms of how it's structured, where it exists, versus San Mateo, for example, proximity to historic neighborhoods. One of the challenges that we face, and you heard a gentleman bring it up, is traffic mitigation. And we've got people driving through our neighborhoods and developments coming online, they're driving their cars. What did you guys, the problem we have is that fees that come from developers go into more or less a general fund that then gets siphoned off to other parts of the city, and the funds don't stay in the neighborhood where the impact is being most keenly felt. Did that occur at all in Redwood City, and what, if anything, were you able to do to mitigate that and ensure those funds were kept where the impact was being felt?
So that's a good question. I mean, we actually are, downtown Redwood City is surrounded by 2 different historical districts. We have the Centennial neighborhood and we have the Sam Heller neighborhood, both developed more than 100 years ago. I think a key thing is just really identifying if you do have this plan and you do have impact fees adopted, identifying the list of improvements that you want to see made in your downtown area, and then making sure as your capital improvement program is adopted from the council on an annual basis, or every 5 years, however you do it, that you see those funds go towards those specific improvements. But really, from the implementation part of the plan, see the actual capital costs that are involved, and then make sure those funds. Now, I would also say is be realistic about how much those people. I think people in general overestimate how much specific developments impact the neighborhood versus just overall regional trends. So I think as you're looking at your capital improvement program, realize that it will take some other funds probably to fix existing problems along with the new problems that development create.
Sure. So you got systemic problems versus.
Yeah. You have old neighborhoods. I mean, the old neighborhoods are going to have problems because, something that we see, for example, in the neighborhoods that were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is and even before that, they were built when school systems used school buses and took everyone around. And now that we all notice locally there's a lot less traffic during summertime than there is during fall and during the spring. And that's because you have just a lot of people coming in the same 15 minutes. So there's some systemic type problems with our infrastructure.
We're just going to be in the last few questions here. So in the back.
I don't know enough about architecture to ask this question precisely, but there's something about new architecture that doesn't please me. I'm not trying to be complaintive. I just want to learn a little bit. I'm thinking about the box building, thinking about the Bay Meadows development in San Mateo, and an older development, now older, around Whole Foods in San Mateo. But there's something about the buildings, they look like they're out on the street. You talk about setbacks and that sort of thing, but to me they're not effective. They just look tall, they look like they're marching out toward the sidewalk. The whole area, particularly the Whole Foods district, feels very congested to me, whether I'm walking or driving or bicycling. New architecture just seems to be much more dense than I like, and I'd like to know what there is about it that I'm feeling. What are you guys designing that I don't like?
I'm not sure how to answer that one. So I think, some of the tools that I talked about include, especially massing, carving the buildings out so they don't appear as big. Thinking about quality materials, not just stucco or hardy siding everywhere, and thinking about key places where you can use a better material help. Having depth to the facades. A lot of new buildings they look quite flat, and even with contemporary design, you can build in recesses and projections and stuff, so it has a more human scale. But in addition to massing, I think the most important thing is parcel size. When you have bigger parcels, it's going to result in a bigger building, and oftentimes that bigger building is being driven by parking requirements. There's a parking garage somewhere on the site that's tied to the amount of units and the parking ratio that necessitates larger, bigger footprint buildings. So if you can have smaller parcels in key places, it kind of messes things up a little bit, and you can have special buildings in those places. So beyond style, there are some techniques to improve the quality of contemporary buildings relative to historic buildings. A parking garage wants to be extremely efficient. A nice, big, rectangular box that is, one level after another that's flat and simple. And the buildings that we love the most are kind of complicated and a little bit odd sometimes. And parking, when parking is the primary driver of how a building is organized, it makes buildings more boring. So if you can reduce the parking requirement for a building, it will help you break up the scale of a building. And then also streets matter a lot too. Often block sizes get really big. And another thing that's often found in historic downtowns are smaller block sizes. So having more street intersections, having more pedestrian connections, having more public spaces helps break down the scale of a building and makes it feel better.
Yes.
Thank you. Every time I hear this, it's always, let's reduce the parking. We're in the 20th century. Why don't we utilize the mechanical lifts and other inventions that will solve both problems? You can have reduced size. We just all have to give up having to park our own vehicles. We're going back. My parents lived here in the Bay Area their whole life. We used to have the best transportation system. It's called the key system. And going back to that day, it was easy to get people out off the buses and in the cars. And now you want to get them out of the car back into a bus. And we're used to freedom. So parking, we all like our cars. I don't drive as much as I used to, but I still need a parking place. And you build a building, like I was talking earlier, we're going to have one here on 3rd Avenue, mechanical lift, to accommodate the parking requirements. Why don't cities look into that? Yes, it's going to cost the developers more, but that has a value to people that want to live there.
I totally agree. Mechanical parking is part of the solution, and you can get, in some cases, you can reduce the amount of space for a parking space by 1/3 if you're using mechanical parking. But yes, there are some trade-offs in terms of convenience there. And there's some operational things that have to go along with it.
Yeah, one thing that we did actually, 2 or 3 of our office buildings, we actually have They don't have traditional parking. It's a parking system that requires a valet to be there at all times. You drop off your cars and you could stack them. They also use an elevator in the building to have less ramp space. And then they're going to build it in with an app so the person working there can just call their car and it'll be ready for them as they come down. So yeah, we did look into that, and it actually is now. Lifts, lifts are a little bit more costly, but this system seemed to pencil out well. And the building actually was parked at less than what's required, and they gave an in lieu fee so we could use that for other parking in the downtown area.
All right, we'll go with the last question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I keep hearing, put your building next to the railroad tracks because people are going to take the train. Well, kind of watching the newspaper, listening to the news, Caltrain is running now probably close to 90% capacity on a regular basis. I know once they get them electrified, it's going to improve capacity maybe by 30%. But if you keep building near the tracks, thinking that the train is going to take care of the problem, there's going to come a time when a single pair of tracks is not going to be enough because we're going to eventually be sharing that with a bullet train. And that's an express train that is not going to help the commuter. I don't think the train is the ultimate answer. And I don't know if anyone's looking at that or not. And it doesn't look like BART's going to come down here because they're doing a lot of improvement on the railroad right-of-ways with no provision for BART in those plans. Have you thought about that? Or is that something that's going to come up and bite us here in a few years?
So I think the answer, yes, over time there's going to be limited capacity on the train. What I will say is, though, that by building in a downtown area, the commute trip is one trip that you reduce overall. But what you actually reduce more over time is the daytime trips. When you're in an isolated office park, people tend to drive more, both to meetings, they drive more to get lunch, they drive more to go to another business. There's called internalization of trips is the technical term, which basically means when you put office space near other retail space, near residential, there's a natural reduction in the total number of auto trips taken. So that's number one. And usually it's, I think, around like 19 or 20%. You just see a reduced number of people driving because they don't have to drive every place. They could walk to get lunch. They don't have to drive. They don't have to drive some other place. The other thing that you see is that people using shuttles more when there is that critical mass of people in a downtown area. It pencils to be able to bring shuttles from point A to point B where there may not be the train, which is on a fixed line. So I do think we're going to have to grapple with the fact that there's going to be limited capacity over time on Caltrain. I'm thankful that there's electrification. I do know that the high-speed rail is going to limit the total number of trips that can be taken because you're going to have the other trains on it. But I do think there's other advantages other than just the commute trips associated with the train.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. Let's please give Aaron and Amit a round.